Hello everybody, welcome back to Needle Workshop. My name is Emily and today I'll be presenting a tutorial for our newest cosplay pattern, which is the Mage coat. So this pattern is super versatile and can be created with or without a fur trim and can also be done entirely without the hood. Just a little more info here before we keep going. So this pattern includes a lining for the hood and can have a lining added for the sleeve as an option, but it does not include any lining for the bodice pieces. This design choice is to more easily accommodate the addition of a fur trim anywhere around the piece or at the sleeves. If ever you'd like a pattern that includes a full lining with a full separate video tutorial, please let us know in the comments below. It's different enough of a pattern that it would warrant its own full set of instructions. As per usual, all our patterns come with super detailed written tutorials that include tons of extra information, such as a measurement guide, a printing guide with various printing options, some material suggestions, and tons of pictures and graphics to help you through the tutorial. The pattern is available in XS to 4XL men's sizing. As always, we recommend making a mock-up before starting. No two bodies are the same, so making a mock-up allows you to make sure that the pattern fits just right and make any adjustments as necessary before working with your really expensive fabric. Also important to note is that the seam allowance for this pattern is 1 centimeter wide unless specified otherwise. And now, without any further ado, let's get started. The first thing we'll need to do is sew the back bodice piece to the front bodice pieces. You'll sew them at the side seam and at the shoulder seam, right side to right side. There's a slight mistake here. Since I'm not putting in a lining, I'll need to overlock my seam allowance at the side seams, which I corrected later. The shoulder seam allowance will be covered with the facing, so it can be left as is, that is to say, with the seam allowance ironed open. If you plan on putting in a hood, we'll need to prep it. It's absolutely possible to make this piece without a hood. The design without the hood would be ideal for any characters who wear this style of jacket almost as a cape. So just skip the steps between this time code and this time code if ever you're planning not to add a hood. Take out your hood and hood band pieces. You'll need to sew the band to the hood pieces right side to right side. Make sure to properly align all your notches and sew in place. You'll iron the seam allowance open once you're done. There's a very strong curve here, so it's really important to properly align all your notches to make sure that everything stays aligned properly. This little area here is also pretty tricky to sew, so let's take a closer look at that. When sewing the pieces together, it's actually better to have the band on top and the hood underneath. But I have it the other way around here so we can take a look at the small curved section of the hood. When sewing this section, you can notch the curve slightly with very small cutters to help position it properly along the band. Now take your piece to the ironing board and with the help of a sewing ham, iron the seam allowance open. Set the piece aside. Next, take out the hood lining and hood band lining. Following the same steps as previously mentioned, sew them together. Take out the hood facing and right side to right side, sew it to the hood lining. Make sure you align the notches on the facing to the seams on the lining. Iron the seam allowance open. Take back out the hood and right side to right side, sew the hood and the hood lining at the front. You'll be sewing from one tip of the long extension all the way across the hood to the other. When sewing, make sure to keep the seam allowance of any piece open as you do so. This is a tip I'd recommend anytime you are sewing two pieces together. The next step is a little odd. Iron the seam allowance of the hood towards the lining and sew in place 3 millimeters from the seam. This step can feel a little weird since you'll have to awkwardly unfold the piece from the neck area. Once you're done, iron the seam flat to help remove any puckering caused by the stitch. Then you can push the lining inward and iron the outer edge flat. Due to our stitch, the seam will naturally roll itself towards the lining. Align the hood and lining along the neck area and stay stitched in place 5 millimeters from the edge. Take your main bodice piece back out. Right side to right side, align the hood of the neckline to the main coat piece. Start by aligning the center back notch of the hood to that of the coat. From here, the shoulder seams will align to the seams of the hood. Before positioning the tip of the hood, make sure to trim some of the excess seam allowance. There will be a notch on the jacket that indicates where to align the tip of the hood. I had forgotten to notch them into my sample, but they are available on the pattern. Sew everything in place 7 millimeters from the edge. Now let's prep our facing. Take out the back facing piece and the front facing pieces and right side to right side, sew them together at the shoulder. Make sure that the center front of the front pieces are facing inward. Iron the seam allowance open. Overlock the hem of the back facing and the outer edge of the front facing pieces. Right side to right side, align the neckline of the facing to the neckline of the coat while making sure to align all your notches and seams properly. This will effectively sandwich your hood in between the two pieces. The facing should align itself all the way down to the hem of the coat. Sew in place, starting at the overlocked bottom edge of the facing, then going all the way around the neckline, all the way to the other side. Cut off the excess seam allowance at the lower corners. You'll also want to cut some notches into the neckline while being careful not to cut into the stitch itself. Iron the seam allowance towards the facing and sew in place 3 mm from the seam. You can start your stitch about 5 cm away from the hem of the coat. Iron the seam flat to help remove any puckering caused by the stitching. Then fold the facing towards the inside of the coat, making sure to push out the corners properly, and then iron the edges flat. At this point, I went ahead and corrected the stitch on my side seam of the jacket by adding an overlock stitch. To finish the hem of the coat, you'll want to iron the hem in twice by 1 cm. This will extend slightly by a few centimeters into the facing. Once you have it ironed down, top stitch in place. Wrong side to wrong side, properly align the armhole of the facing to the armhole of the coat. Stay stitched together 5 mm from the edge. Now it's time to prep our sleeves. I'd like to point out that the pattern has 2 sleeve models that come with the pattern. A much wider model like the one I'm using in this tutorial, as well as a more narrow sleeve model. Right side to right side, fold the sleeve in half and sew together at the side seam. If like me, you plan on putting in a lining, iron the seam allowance open. If you don't plan on inserting a lining, then make sure to overlock the seam like we did for the side seam of the coat. Next, repeat the same step for the lining. The lining is the same pattern piece as the self. Right side to right side, align the sleeve and its lining together and sew in place at the hem of the sleeve. If you don't want a lining, then just turn the hem in twice by 1 cm and top stitch in place like we did for the hem of the jacket. Turn the self and lining inside out and iron the edge of the hem flat. Wrong side to wrong side, align the sleeve at the armhole and sew in place 5 mm from the edge. Here's a useful little tip for you. Oftentimes, the lining fabric can be very slippery and hard to cut. This can result in it not aligning perfectly with the pattern piece. In this particular scenario, I would recommend making sure to properly align your sleeve self and lining and cutting off any excess lining at the armhole if you have any. Having too much lining to self in terms of length will give you a lining that keeps riding out of the sleeve. It's not ideal, and it's something that can easily be corrected here. Next, we'll be lightly gathering the crown of our sleeve from the front notch to the double back notch. Make sure you have your sleeves aligned to the right side of the coat. Pin your sleeve to the coat, right side to right side. You can start by aligning the side seams together, followed by the top notch of the sleeve to the shoulder seam of the coat. You'll then have a double notch at the back and a single notch at the front. Sew in place 1 centimeter from the edge, followed by an overlock. You'll be ironing the seam allowance towards the sleeve. This whole last section is optional and is only if you want to add fur trim to the jacket. Personally, I decided to add trim only at the center front and around the hood, but you can also add fur trim at the hem of the jacket or at the hem of the sleeves, so on and so forth. I'll go over all the details of the application for all those areas. I'm starting by roughly measuring out how long of a trim I'll need for the section I want to put fur on. Since I only want fur on the center front and around the hood, my measurement can be pretty forgiving. I just need a strip of fur long enough to cover the full length. My trim is 8 centimeters wide total, but will be folded in half. Not to mention that 1 centimeter needs to be accounted for seam allowance on both sides. This gives me a finished trim of 3 centimeters wide. Both the section at the front and hem of the jacket can be done using loosely calculated measurements, but if you need trim along the sleeves, you'll need to make sure to properly measure out the length you'll need. To do this, I recommend using the pattern to properly measure that out. I'll go into more details on how to properly apply the fur trim around the sleeves a little later. The direction of the fur is very important and will vary from section to section. Here's my personal suggestion for each section. The fur on the hood and center front should be divided as follows. The top part of the hood should be cut along the warp with the fur facing away from the jacket, and the rest of the section should be cut along the weft with the fur facing towards the ground. The hem of the sleeves and coat should be cut along the warp with the fur facing away from the jacket. Faux fur is also very expensive, so I recommend using several strips of fabric to get the full length you need. I use a box cutter on the wrong side of the fabric to cut all my fur. When sewing your pieces to each other, make sure to brush as much fur out of the way as you can. You want to minimize any fur getting caught in the stitch. Right side to right side, I'm pinning my fur in place along the hood and the front of my jacket. I have a longer strip than I need and will be cutting off the excess once it's fully sewn in place. Make sure to leave a little bit of extra fabric at the ends. Usually we do 1 centimeter for seam allowance. When sewing, again, try to move as much fur as possible out of the way to avoid it getting caught in the stitch. To finish off our fur application on the inside of the coat, you can either turn the fur in a little past the stitch and stitch in place with a stitch in the ditch, or you can turn in your fur by 1 centimeter, align it to the stitch, and sew in place by hand. Turning it in by 1 centimeter can make the fur very thick, and if you were to sew it in place with a machine, your machine might have a hard time if it's not an industrial machine or a machine made for thick fabric. Sewing it by hand gives a very clean finish, gives you a little bit more control, takes a little bit longer, but is still, in my opinion, the easier method. The ends of the strips are then turned in by 1 centimeter and sewn shut either by machine or by hand. If you're adding fur to the hem, then make sure to cut the ends of the strip that we just applied flush to the hem. Then that section will be covered with the fur piece at the hem, and that piece will be finished at each end by folding it in by 1 centimeter and sewing that shut. Now the reason you need a proper measurement for the sleeves is that you'll be sewing the strips in a loop before applying them to the sleeve. Otherwise, every other step stays exactly the same. And with that, your project is complete. I think that covers everything for today's video. So as always, please like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Your support is always super appreciated and obviously helps with the growth of the channel. And as always, you can follow us on any of our socials and you can tag us in your projects if ever you want us to see and share your work. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. And as always, good luck with your projects, guys. Bye-bye.